Take me to your leader. I said, take me to your leader. Hey guys, it's just me, Mr. Swanson here, coming to you with an audio guide. Woo! Audio guide for a day that either I'm not in class or you're not in class. Today we are hanging out in the Cold War for a third day in a row. We'll call this Cold War Part 3. And specifically, we're going to be looking at President Kennedy in the Cold War. Kennedy and his accomplishments in the Cold War. So go ahead and remember where we've come from. We're talking through the Cold War presidents. Truman and his doctrine, Marshall and his plan, get fit in there, containment, the splash zone, working our way through some of the accomplishments of the president. So we see Kennedy here. Now I want to tell you in our class, we are going to walk through each of these men specifically. We're starting with the Cold War, and then we will walk through the presidents specifically. So the Cold War presidents of the modern era. And of course, today we are focusing on this man, myth, and legend, John F. Kennedy, your 35th president, and his accomplishments in the Cold War. Far out in space. Who doesn't like to talk about space? Ready, set, here we go. Now, my recommendation for you is that you pull up the PDF from our Google Classroom. You know that if you're in my class, you have a toolbox worth of notes and activities to stay on top of. And whether I'm not in class or you're not in class and you find yourself watching this video, you need to accomplish the set of notes and associated readings and activities with Cold War Day 3. So my recommendation to you would be pull up that PDF and listen as I talk. The resolution on the screen probably be a little bit better through the PDF. Or hey, watch my pretty face here and catch the video as we go. So let's do that. Ready, set, let's go. I have a question for you. Spidey is asking us here, how do you win a game? How do you win a game? You're probably sitting there thinking, duh, you put the most points on the scoreboard. Anyone knows that at the end of the game, when the buzzer sounds, the team with the more points wins. How do you win a game? You put more points on the scoreboard. Obviously, as the referee here is referring, the winner of the game has more points on the scoreboard. I got a different question for you. Spidey's going to come back to us. How do you win a race? Cross-country runners, okay, you know that there is some scoring involved in cross-country, first place versus seventh place, a little bit of a way that you can kind of put points on the scoreboard. But generally speaking, how do you win a race? Well, dang, you cross the finish line first. So we're going to have to ask ourselves, why is it called the space race? Well, because if it was called the space game, the United States clearly does not win the game. Look at the graphic here. First artificial satellite in space, Sputnik 1, points for the Soviet Union. First animal in space, points for the Soviet Union. First photographs of the far side of the moon, first person in space, first woman in space, first spacewalk, first spacecraft landing on the moon. If these are points on the scoreboard, all those points go to our opponent, the Soviet Union. Well, as Americans, we might want to refer to it as the space race, because if winning the race means walking on the moon, bada bing, bada boom, that's us. Neil Armstrong, Apollo 11, floss it up just like your NASA man on the screen is there. We win the race of being the first person to having the first person to walk on the moon. And you can see that the Soviets actually continue to put points on the scoreboard. First spacecraft to land on another planet, Venus, first space station, first spacecraft landing on Mars. But dang, if President Nixon did not declare us the winners of the space race. So as we look at some of these details here, keep all of those political phrasings in mind. We call it the space race. We're the first to walk on the moon. We showed it on television on top of that. And in U.S. history, we will say that we won the space race and alleviated some of the tensions of the Cold War in doing so. So all that, let's jump into it. I know I got some dog lovers in the room here. I want to show you, this is the first animal in space. She's a female dog named Laika. She actually travels into space on Sputnik 2, Sputnik number 2, which is a Soviet spacecraft, Soviet space satellite. A little bit of sad story for Laika. She was a street dog. She was collected off the street to go into space, and bottom line is see how long she could orbit before she died. So she died in space. They measured her oxygen intake. How long can a creature stay in space and survive? And she did die in space. The night before she went into space, they let her eat all that she wanted. I think they brought in some scraps and hamburgers for her to eat. knowing that she's going to go into space and die in space. This is Laika, the first animal in space. All right, on your notes there, space race, the actual core definitions. What is a space race? It is a symbolic competition between the Cold War powers, USA, USSR, resulting in science and technological advances for humankind. A lot of the Cold War we've been talking about, destructive to humanity, negative for mankind. But in this case, even though amidst the tensions of the Cold War, we are going to see some positive advances in the Cold War. And that is one of the positive outcomes of the Cold War. Amidst the negative, amidst the competitions that are a little bit more hostile, we are going to see some positive advances for humanity in the space race. I will post this video, and I challenge you to make sure you fully understand the space race. Whether you watch the video or just stick with my notes, make sure you fully understand the space race. From the space race, kind of walk through some of the mechanics here now. We get Sputnik 1. Sputnik 1 is the first artificial satellite to orbit the Earth. It is, remember the scoreboard, it was launched by the Soviet Union. Okay, they put the first points on the scoreboard by launching this satellite into a low Earth orbit on October 4th, 1957. And Sputnik 1 is exactly what you see on your screen there. It is just a 150-pound ball of lead put into the sky, orbiting the Earth. It was not carrying a missile, but did we know that at the time? The headlines that greeted the country the next day was Russian satellite circling the Earth. Duck and cover now, because it's coming for you, right? Nobody knew if there was a nuclear warhead coming to a city near you. Is it going to land in New York City? Is it going to land in San Francisco? Or are they targeting Washington, D.C., any major metropolis? In the end, no, it was nothing more than a ball of metal orbiting the Earth. But they were the first to do it, and nobody knew what its capabilities were. And even though this was not armed with a warhead, what if the next one? What if the next one might be? So a lot of fear that came out of the Russians being the first to put a satellite into space. Whoa, what's that? Oh, it seems we have another something in satellite, something in orbit there. Crazy guy. Never know what's next. Well, from this, NASA is created in response to Sputnik. I know you see this logo here. There's actually a NASA sticker on my podium. For some reason, NASA's become a real popular logo to have on hoodies, hats, shirts, what have you. I mean, you can go to Target and buy a t-shirt that has NASA on it. So good branding by NASA in that regard. Well, NASA is actually a federal organization created in response to Sputnik. American realized if we're not first, you ain't first, you last. Well, we want to catch up. Okay, we were not the first to put a satellite into orbit, but dang, if we're not going to try to catch up. So we create the National Aeronautical and Space Association, NASA, National Aeronautical and Space Association, in order to do that. So one, kind of the takeaway here is it was out of the fear of having the Russians having put Sputnik into orbit first, and two, it was to catch up. Right? If we are behind in math and science, if our children are not being able to catch up in school, not able to keep up in school, we need to do something about that. So we create NASA to start streamlining the growth of our national math and science technologies, and ultimately to continue to try to beat the Russians to the moon. See, if we didn't put the first points on the scoreboard, let's change the goalpost. Let's change the measurement. Let's race to the moon. Okay, all right, the Russians got the first points, but if we can still beat them to the moon, that became the goal. Picture here shows another kind of a thing that comes out of Sputnik being launched into orbit. These are school children ducking and covering in an emergency drill, not all that different from the way we have. We have tornado drills, we have fire drills, we have active shooter drills. Well, if you grew up in the 50s, you might have had a duck and cover drill. And you see the teacher lower left in his suit and jacket. And, I'm kind of glad teachers don't dress like that anymore, don't have to dress like that anymore. You see the children well-dressed as well. But what you really see here is everyone ducking under their desk, covering their heads. And I like to call it duck cover and kiss it goodbye, because I just don't think that your desktop is going to protect you from a nuclear strike in your town. So a lot of the psychology of the duck and cover drills was that we were going to do something. Most researchers came to the conclusion that ducking and covering and hiding under anything, desk, file cabinet, heavy door, inside the building, covering with anything was actually not going to do anything in the event of a real nuclear strike. But from the American perspective, this at least gave us the attitude of we're doing something. If my city, my town is going to be targeted by the Soviets, Well, practicing duck and cover drill is going to give me a sense of a feeling that I'm going to be able to protect myself in some way. Decades later, we can kind of debunk the mechanics of the drill and understand it wouldn't have actually done anything at all. But at the time, it was giving Americans kind of a sense of a response. I'm doing something to fight back against the what the Soviets are putting in the sky. So kind of a takeaway from the Sputnik 1. As a machine, it was not going to damage anything. As something going into space, it was just baby step number one. Still a long ways away from actually putting a rocket into orbit, much less a person on the moon. But what Sputnik 1 really accomplished was between the ears, in our minds, created a lot of fear in the American public. This slide right here, you're going to need to write this on your notes. Write everything in green. The influences of Sputnik, very similar to things I've already said. So we're going to see an increase in funding for science and math education. If the Russians created this technology first, well, that must mean we're not training our kids well enough. The math and science class you sit in today is a result of Sputnik 1 in 1957. Your increased focus on math and science in your liberal arts education today is because of this era of an increased funding for science and math education. So thanks, Russians. If you don't like your science and math class, you can thank the Russians. Creation of a national space program, that is NASA, inspires the development of a variety of new technologies. These start to go hand in hand. We're going to train our kids better on math and science. We're going to have a national space technology program. We are going to start to have better production of technologies that are going to lead us to the moon. And that final statement I made, an increased fear of a missile strike by the Soviets against the United States. What if the next one's coming for me? Okay, we recognize Sputnik was just a ball of lead. What if the next one is coming for me? That messed with a lot of people and inspired a generation of fear from this first satellite. Ultimately, not talking about him so much today, but President Eisenhower, who will feed into President Kennedy. Eisenhower passes a variety of policies against the Soviet Union. President Kennedy inherits a variety of these policies as well. So presidential involvement. Always recommending movies to you. The movie Hidden Figures is about these early days of space and technology development. Ultimately, the Hidden Figures were some African-American ladies very involved in the math of landing on the moon, although they didn't get credit for it at the time. It really comes from a book. 4 ladies at first. The movie kind of streamlines them into 3 characters. You know how Hollywood does. A great true story and a movie that students are generally familiar with. If you're not familiar with it, maybe you should check it out. Next vocab word. Well, all this is going to lead to the moon landing. So Americans are fascinated by the ingenuity of the space program. The Russians got to orbit first, but we can still put our boots on the moon first, and that's exactly what the goal becomes. President Kennedy, in his early days, gives a very famous speech. It's called the Moonshot speech. He's basically setting the goal of landing on the moon, and he gives it a timeline. Very good strategy. Anytime you have a goal is to put a timeline on it. I want to be able to lift this much weight by the end of the football season. I want to be able to run this fast in order for the state cross country meet. Like if you set a goal but you don't put a time on it, are you as motivated to achieve it? President Kennedy did a very smart thing, classic goal setting theory. He put a timeline for achieving this goal, and his phrase is, by the end of the decade, we should put a man on the moon. Well, he's saying this in the 60s, so he means by the end of the 60s, we should put a man on the moon. This is his actual quote. I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before the decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to Earth. Let's find out if we do. Well, the moon landing. So your next vocab term and what you need to write. There's a series of space programs and aircraft type, spacecraft type, which this class is not really going to get into. But ultimately, the Apollo spacecraft, the 11th iteration. We're going to call it Apollo 11. That means there was an Apollo 1, 2, 3, 4, all the way up to Apollo 11. The first Apollos were tests. Can we get off the ground? Can we go into orbit? Can we circle the moon? Can the moon's gravity pull us? So each was a baby step closer to landing on the moon. Ultimately, the Apollo 11 lunar module carrying Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin landed on the moon on July 20th, 1969, and the U.S. won the space race. If the race became to walk on the moon, the U.S. won the space race. And more than that, we put it on television. Major impact of a new technology, television. Hey, you know what they say? Pictures worth 1,000 words. Prove it to me. Okay, don't just tell me you walked on the moon. Prove to me that you walked on the moon. So the television broadcast goes all over the country, all over the world, shows the American astronauts planting the American flag on the moon. And formally, or rather, I should say the word informally, the space race between the U.S. and the USSR was symbolically completed with the planting of the American flag in space. The Soviets never pursued landing on the moon after that. They said, we're not going to be second. So this was kind of a informal conclusion to what was the space race. We'll talk about the future of space exploration here in just a second. Love this picture here. These are the men who did what no one else has ever done before. Lower left, Neil Armstrong, first man to walk on the moon. Lower right, while these men were walking on the moon. I like to point out Michael Collins because the mission would not have been possible without Michael Collins. I like to point out that there needs to be a Michael Collins on every team. We remember the name Neil Armstrong. Okay, it's a key vocab. It's in your U.S. history class. We tend to remember Buzz Aldrin, second man to walk on the moon. He did put his feet on the moon, and we remember him in a unique way. I'll tell you in a second. We don't very often remember Michael Collins, and I wish that we would. I wish that you would consider being the type of teammate like Michael Collins was. He gave up his opportunity to walk on the moon. Out of selflessness, he said, I'll pilot this thing. I know I can't get out. Okay, I can't park it, turn it off, put the keys in my pocket, and walk on the moon. And spacecraft don't work like that. Michael Collins says, I'll stay in orbit. Okay, I'll fly this thing while you guys walk on the moon. And he selflessly did so. So I just challenge you to be the kind of teammate, be the kind of person, maybe it's family member that Michael Collins was. And I would challenge you to remember the name Michael Collins, history's greatest teammate. Whether history really remembers his name as a first or not, we should remember him as history's greatest teammate. There's a very easy way to remember landing on the moon, and it goes a little bit like this. We went to the moon in 1969, not 1970, but the year before. Aha! I grew up TV show with the TV show Eve and Stevens on the Disney Channel. I've always wanted to do this. Let me try this. My name is Mr. Swanson, and you're watching the Disney Channel. I hope that worked. I'll post this video. It's corny. It's cringy. It's probably words y'all would use. It will help you remember when we land on the moon. Not 1970, but the year before. Watch this video. We went to the moon in 1969, and you will not forget. This is a setup that I got to see at a museum one time. This is actually a space museum in Oklahoma City from a man who's from Oklahoma, and he was a NASA astronaut. Never walked on the moon, but he built a museum dedicated to space. And this is an accurate setup of what the lunar lander looked like. And I was struck by two things. One, how big it was, and two, how big it wasn't. I was struck by how big it was because it was a very cavernous room, and you can see the lunar module, and okay, that's sizable. I mean, you can see me standing there. It's a little bit up on an elevated platform. But I was also struck by the idea of how not small it was. This structure took men millions of miles from Earth to the moon and brought them back. Now, that structure itself was ejected into space, and this capsule brought them back. But that tin-foiled structure took a man to the moon and brought him back safely. So I was simultaneously gripped by how big it was and how big it wasn't. I will acknowledge there are some controversies and some conspiracy theories about did we land on the moon or not. Sometimes they center on big, small things such as, well, the flag. How come the flag is standing straight out? Well, I can solve that one for you. It's because there was a wire in the flag that made it hold its shape. A wire that made it hold that rectangular shape. So, gravity would have had the flag flying upward, and it's just standing too still. I can debunk that one for you. Well, how about this? How about the shadows? The astronauts are casting very strange shadows. Yes, that's because shadows don't behave exactly like they do on Earth, where the sun was relative to the moon gives a unique shadow, and we can answer that one as well. Now, bigger conspiracy theories, some would say everybody was in on the lie. Everybody at NASA was collaborating towards a lie. Everybody knew we weren't landing on the moon, but our government wanted to win the space race, so everybody lied about it together. If everybody lied about it, perhaps it would be hard to prove if they all stayed on the same page. But I'll challenge you with this. My thoughts on conspiracy theories, and as we get into the modern era, we're going to talk about some more of them. My thoughts on conspiracy theories is this. The bigger the lie, the harder it is to keep it a secret. If you're going to tell, if one person's going to come up with a lie, they got to keep that lie for themselves, and that's one person involved. I would suggest as soon as two people are involved, you got a lot harder time keeping your story straight, much less the thousands of people that worked at NASA. Do you really think that a big government conspiracy could have hidden all the mathematical calculations, all the scientific reports, the idea if we couldn't land on the moon, there's a report that would say, oh, the moon is not suitable for humans to land on. Do you think everyone that read that report was going to keep it a secret for all these decades? So I don't know. Okay, I've done as much primary source reading as possible for a high school teacher. I do believe we landed on the moon. I would say I'd hate to be teaching a lie. So I do believe the story of landing on the moon. I do believe the science behind landing on the moon. And we're going to talk about getting back to the moon here in just a second as well. And I do believe that it is possible. This is Buzz Aldrin. This is a very famous photograph of Buzz Aldrin. A lot of people think this is the first man to walk on the moon. It's not. It's actually the second. Does anybody wonder where Buzz Aldrin went to college? As a matter of fact, Buzz Aldrin is a West Point graduate, class of 1951. And of course, he is known for being the second man on the moon. Nope, Michael Collins, also a West Point graduate, the pilot of the command module, also a West Point graduate. Neil Armstrong, a graduate of Purdue University. So no Naval Academy graduates in the first moon landing crew, and that is what matters to me. Buzz Aldrin here again, another famous picture of Buzz Aldrin. Back to the idea that the flag is sticking out straight. Yes, because there's a wire holding it. The shadows, the footprints. How come the footprints, how come they're just holding their perfect little form? That's a part of the anti-gravity on the moon as well. Oh, look, aliens. Maybe there are aliens. Maybe it's just your weird teacher's Bitmoji as well. How do we know Buzz Aldrin today? Well, if you said he's the namesake for Buzz Lightyear in Disney Pixar's Toy Story, you would be correct. Buzz Aldrin, a very eccentric personality. He was eccentric before the moon landings. He was a media sensation afterwards, and he is the namesake of Buzz Aldrin, the Toy Story character. You can see on his hand there, he is wearing his West Point ring, and on his right-hand side, he's wearing a ring that depicts the moon and the stars. And of course, he's wearing his Apollo 11 jacket, and he's at Disney World. He is at Tomorrowland holding a Buzz Lightyear action figure. I think that's pretty cool. Buzz Aldrin is in his 80s today, and he is still active on social media. He has a very interesting Instagram account and Facebook account. Now, I don't know if he makes his own posts. I know there's a lot of social media managers in the world today. I hope he does, because he's very witty. He's very funny. And he is involved. He is focused on the next frontier. If his generation headed to the moon, what do you think, as an explorer, what do you think he values? I hope you would say he values the next step of exploration. So what is that? Well, if you're looking at his t-shirt, you can see that he wants us to get to Mars. His big focus is he's got a program called Destination Mars. And he also has a saying. He puts this on some of his t-shirts, which I don't put on your screen here. His saying is GYATM. And I'll just tell you that TM means to Mars. Get to Mars. His t-shirt says GYATM. He is a funny, funny guy. West Point plug here. At West Point, much of the history we teach is made by the people we taught. And you do have some notable astronauts on the screen there, speaking for the West Point History Department. That's not one of them, okay? Bitmoji, you don't belong there. I have certainly never entered the Army space program. I'll post this video as well. Did the U.S. go to the moon to beat the Soviets? Some history of some facts of the history, as well as the question, what does it mean to be racing to the moon? Great video there. So after we landed on the moon, then what? Well, this is extra, and I'll tell you, this is not a part of your Georgia standards, a little bit extra here. In 1979, the Apollo mission remained active, and Soyuz is the Russian counterpart. 1975, there was a joint mission called the Apollo-Soyuz Test Project to dock an American Apollo aircraft in orbit with a Soviet Soyuz aircraft. The American commander for this mission was Lieutenant General Thomas Stafford, and he is actually from the state of Oklahoma, and the museum that I went to, that was his museum. So you got Stafford and 3 Americans, and then you got 2 Soviets, and right in front of them there, you see the model. This is on the ground, of course, but the plan was for them to dock their 2 spacecrafts in space. 1975. the Cold War is ongoing. The Americans had walked on the moon 6 years previous, and actually 5 more missions would go on to walk on the moon. Why in the world, at the height of the Cold War, arguably, would we do this? Why would these two countries agree to dock their spacecrafts in the air? Well, I think I think this is one of the positives of the Cold War, is that we are interested in scientific growth and development, putting aside the politics of the era and deciding that we could do something that benefits humanity. This is Stafford wearing his orange jumpsuit and the Russian commander. The two spacecrafts have docked, and each spacecraft opens its access door. And between the two, the men reach forward and shake hands in what is known as the Great Handshake. You see this next picture kind of coming from a different perspective. The Russian reaching forward, Stafford in orange reaching back. This is called the Great Handshake between the world's two superpowers, feuding with each other on the international stage, but shaking hands in space. Later, Buzz Aldrin would say of this, we need more handshakes in space. And I firmly agree with that. At General Stafford's museum, this is the actual Apollo door that opened where the Great Handshake occurred. And much like that picture, I mean, I couldn't pass up the opportunity to reach my hand outward and like I'm recreating the Great Handshake. I do realize I happen to be wearing the exact same shirt there as well. So you see the picture above the item, and then you see the historical artifact, the Great Handshake. We need more handshakes in space. I agree with that. Well, what is the legacy of the space program? Beyond the fear created by Sputnik 1, here's what we get out of NASA. Here's what we get out of our explorations of space. We get improved satellite telecommunications. That gives us the global positioning systems, GPS. The cell phone you have in your hand, the 5G that it runs off of, say thanks to NASA for that. Say thanks to space exploration for that. We get global photography, things like Google Earth, which is nice to navigate in and around town. It's nice to be able to pull it up on your phone, see your house or someone else's house, zoom in, take a screenshot. That's nice. But global photography is more beneficial for helping with weather patterns, fighting forest fires, anticipating natural disasters and weather events. So global photography, it matters. Weather forecasting comes from these technologies as well. We get some fundamental advances in disease research. The ability to test the human body, test cells, test proteins, test cancer treatments in a zero-gravity environment. All of that comes from our exploration of space. Advanced firefighting technology. You got to think that the worst thing that could happen in a spacecraft is a fire. So they developed a variety of ways to combat fire. And of course, we can use that on our planet as well. Improved water purification and purification systems. And at its simplest level, improved snow and cold weather gear. If you go skiing today, you're probably wearing some spacesuit technology in order to stay warm. So plenty of positives that are the legacy of the space program. What about today? What about NASA today? Well, today, NASA is operating not in the Apollo systems, but the next frontier for space travel is called Artemis. Artemis, very interestingly, is the twin sister of Apollo. In Greek mythology, Apollo, male, Artemis, female. Artemis is the twin sister of Apollo. That's a pretty appropriate naming system for the next aircraft. Artemis 1 launched to the moon a year and a half ago, and they launched into orbit just to prove that it could be done. This is Artemis 2. Okay, these individuals, these astronauts have already been picked for the Artemis mission number 2. The Artemis 2 mission is supposed to launch later this year, in 2024. We're approaching 2024, and their goal is to go to the backside of the moon. Their goal is to use the moon's gravity to go all the way to the backside of the moon, prove that it can be done. And then Artemis 3, set to launch in the year 2025, is designed to set foot on the moon again. So we are supposed to be going back to the moon again in 2025, and I hope that we do. You can see the crew there, female, be the first female to approach the backside of the moon. You got a Canadian. So a multinational and international collaboration to get back to the moon. So Kennedy and the space race and all of those facts. I hope you've learned something over the last 30 minutes. Next piece of Kennedy and the Cold War is going to be U.S. involvement in Cuba. So U.S. involvement in Cuba consists of various actions by the United States to attempt to overthrow the communist dictator of Cuba, Fidel Castro. You have President Kennedy. A lot of girls in the class always think he's a dreamboat. And the ladies, does he make you swoon? Well, his counterpart in the story here is Fidel Castro. Not as good looking. He's the dictator of the country of Cuba. Cuba is located 90 miles off the southern tip of Florida, relatively close to the United States, you might say. So if you're going to be able to have communist influence 90 miles away from the United States, we're probably going to be concerned. If you think that, you are correct. Continuing with the definition here, a variety of tensions in the country eventually lead to what is known as the Cuban Missile Crisis, which is going to be the peak of concern with our involvement with Cuba. I'll post this video here, a great illustration of what is the Cuban Missile Crisis, worth your while to watch it, and I'm going to go ahead and describe it in my own way right here. So our involvement starts in the year 1961. The United States began planning to overthrow Fidel Castro. They realized that Castro has gone communist. If he's going to cozy up to the USSR, man, that's just not going to be good for us 90 miles away from Florida. Well, how can we do this? We don't want to get directly involved. But I wonder if we could train some rebels to overthrow him for us, maybe even equipping them along the way. Unwilling to be directly involved in the overthrow of the government, the United States uses the CIA to train and carry out a military coup against the Castro government. That means overthrowing the Castro government, but no Americans involved directly, just indirectly training these rebels that are supposed to be doing the dirty work for us. The plan was to land at a location known as the Bay of Pigs and use U.S. aircraft and equipment to support these rebels storming into the Cuban capital. So on April 5th, 1961, these trained rebels land, but were very quickly crushed by the Cuban Army and Air Force. The aircraft that we promised never showed up. And actually, Kennedy got cold feet at the last minute. He did not want U.S. missiles to be involved. So these rebels were basically unsupported and very quickly crushed by the better equipped, better trained Cuban Army and Air Force. Well, this is all supposed to be secret, but now it is out in the open. President Kennedy refused to use U.S. air support to cover the invasion forces. The captured exiles revealed the United States support that they had been receiving, and Castro then went to the Soviet Union for military and economic support. If the Americans are going to train some rebels, then we're going to get our friends, the Soviets, to back us up as well. We wanted to stay out of it, but the captured Cuban soldiers, they sang the song, if you will, and all of a sudden our involvement was now known. Soviet government saw Castro's gesture as a way to expand the Cold War into the Western Hemisphere and frustrate the new presidential administration. Kennedy was pretty new on the job. His handling of the Bay of Pigs is considered very poor leadership. Okay, that's not me picking at the man. That's history reflecting on what is the Cuban Missile Crisis and Kennedy's actions during those days. He was a young president, inexperienced internationally, and quite frankly, he probably walked us into a more complicated situation with his handling of the Bay of Pigs crisis. So thumbs down for JFK following the Bay of Pigs. Leads to the Cuban Missile Crisis. So two separate events. Bay of Pigs sets the conditions for the Cuban Missile Crisis. Relationship between the U.S. and Cuba was further strained in 1962 when Castro allowed medium-range nuclear missiles into Cuba. Soviet Union supplied the missiles, and they very conveniently using Cuba as a landing base 90 miles away from the United States. Medium range, meaning that they got a pretty fair distance that they can strike. Quite frankly, now they're able to attack most of the United States, Central America, and Canada. I'll show you a range of, I'll show you a circle for how far they can reach here in just a second. Castro allowed the Soviet Union to put nuclear missiles in Cuba in order to shorten the time the Soviet missiles would have to reach targets in the United States. These missiles would have been where these missiles were placed. Most of the United States, Canada, and Latin America were within the range of attack. Oh no. Here is the actual spy photography that proves the situation. I know when you look at this, you probably don't see much here, but what these are images of the missile silos and other equipment that was going to be related to launching the missiles. So you see a ready tip, you see a launch position, you see a trailer that's kind of moving the missiles and equipment into place. This location right here was launch site number 2. Overhead photography is what got these pictures for us. And once we had this intelligence, it was, oh no, we are in a bad spot. We got to do something about it. This picture right here shows short, medium, and long range missiles. So the medium range missile, you can see the second circle there. Washington, D.C.'s right in range. Cincinnati, St. Louis, Dallas, San Antonio, Atlanta, about half the United States, Central America, and potentially even into Canada as well. So very negative situation overall. Here's how America responded. This is Miami Beach in October of 1962. So imagine just going for a drive in your sweet vehicle there, but you have anti-aircraft rockets on the beach. You just wanted to go to the beach, but the military is ready for an invasion through Miami. That's pretty scary right there. You got some soldiers right here dug into a machine gun position on the beach. I wanted to go get a tan. I wanted to relax. And right next to me, there's some soldiers getting ready for war. So you don't often think about war coming to the American home front. A lot of Americans were very fearful at this time, especially images like this. President Kennedy did a lot of communicating with the country throughout this time. He was on the radio and television. Okay, he's using television as a way to connect to the country. So picture here showing him communicating with the country. He said that the U.S. would wreak a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union if any missile was fired upon any nation in the Western Hemisphere. Going back to that brinkmanship, that mutually assured destruction, you strike me, we're going to obliterate you. Don't strike me because we will obliterate you. So you strike me, I'm striking you. Who strikes first, the other one's going to get it. This is the chaos of the mutually assured destruction. Well, would you imagine there's more to the story? There always is. We didn't like them putting missiles in Cuba. I'm going to put a Soviet flag right on Cuba. You can see how close that is to Florida. You can see how that would reach most of the United States. Well, guess what? Amidst this, us versus them, we had missiles in northern Turkey. So I'll put the United States flag over Turkey, and then I'll do the best I can with this graphic. That's the Soviet Union. That's Russia. Our missiles were always close to them. I suppose they're thinking what's good for the goose is good for the gander. They got missiles in Turkey that can reach us. We just want to have missiles in Cuba that can reach them, us and them, us and them. Can you see? We're angry that they bring missiles to Cuba, but all the while we've had our missiles in Turkey. There's always more to the story. Let's see how it ends. Kennedy addressing the nation on television, from the podium, etc. All very important times. So here's how the story ends. When the missiles were discovered, the Kennedy administration ordered a naval blockade of Cuba rather than a direct military strike. We're going to try to do diplomacy. We're going to try to do economic versus a direct military invasion. We know that won't end up well. It's kind of also part of the mutually assured destruction. You invade me, I'm invading you. You bomb me, I'm invading you. So it kind of goes both ways there. President feared that such an attack, a direct attack, would escalate into all-out war with the Soviets. That's what we're trying to avoid. As nuclear warheads made their way to Cuba on Soviet ships, the Soviet Union agreed to withdraw its missiles from Cuba if the United States would withdraw its missiles from Turkey and pledge to not invade Cuba. You take yours away from Turkey, I'll take mine away from Cuba. No harm, no foul either way. And we just continue on like normal, like nothing ever happened. Both sides agree to this, and what was known as the Cuban Missile Crisis was concluded after 13 days of high tension and uncertainty. Okay, a lot of times this is referred to as the 13 days, and the country, the world, wondered every day, every hour, are we a step closer to annihilation? 13 long days of tension and uncertainty. So I'll show you the map here one more time so you can kind of put in your brains exactly what we just said. Would you believe it? There's a movie called 13 Days about this whole story, and it is extraordinary. Keeps you hanging on every twist and turn. All right, my friends, that was JFK in the Cold War, space race, interactions with Cuba. I got places to go. May the odds be ever in your favor. From room 1206, out.